Let's ask about unreliable manuscripts then, that first question. And we're going to focus in particular on the New Testament. The New Testament is the kind of latter third of the Bible. These are the documents written around the time of Jesus, of his life. And think about those. That means that we're talking about, I keep trying to click that and I haven't actually plugged it in, so we'll just do that. We'll just think about a quick timeline and think about those documents written around the time of Jesus. Most people, Christian and non-Christian, would agree that the text that we're talking about for the New Testament written somewhere between AD 40 and AD 90. And the big question is, well, what happens to those texts as they are copied, as they are translated, as they are passed on down through the centuries? What happens? How much goes wrong? How much confusion creeps in? Are there mistakes? Are people twisting it? What happens? Well, maybe a helpful way to answer it is to think about someone called Erasmus. Erasmus was a great Christian scholar working in the 16th century. And in 1516, he publishes his Greek New Testament. So he is working with the manuscripts that are available to him and trying to establish, what does the New Testament say? What is the Greek of the New Testament? Now, he's working with some manuscripts that date from the 12th century. So Erasmus, he's got some manuscripts that are about 300 years old, and he's working with those and trying to establish what the text is. Now, you might well think there is a big question then about this great big gap between the time when the New Testament was written and the manuscripts that Erasmus is able to work from in the 12th century. First thing to say is that's not actually as much of a problem as you might think. We are actually very confident of first century texts, even if there are centuries before we've actually got a manuscript of that text. So if you're trying to understand, for example, the life of the Emperor Tiberius, he's alive around the time of Jesus, then you've got a Roman writer called Suetonius, who writes about the lives of the Caesars, one of the best sources we've got for the life of Tiberius. The earliest manuscripts we've got for Suetonius comes from the 9th century. But we're not particularly worried about that. We're pretty confident that we've got Suetonius's text. We can learn about the life of Tiberius, even with 9 centuries or so of gap between his life and when the first manuscripts appear. So anyone here doing classics, you're just pretty used to trusting big gaps in manuscripts. Not always a problem. Happily, though, since the time of Erasmus, we've actually found many, many more manuscripts to work from. In Erasmus's time, as we said, the best things that he had access to were these 2 12th century manuscripts, these 12th century copies. Since the 16th century, we've discovered many, many more manuscripts, thousands more. Lots of them are from this period, from the kind of medieval period, but there are quite a number that come from the early centuries, from 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. One of them is really local to us. It's a very small fragment. This is here in the Bodleian. It is a fragment of the book of Acts from the New Testament, and this comes from around 250 AD. From about 100 years later, we have this. This is called Codex Sinaiticus. It's called Sinaiticus because it was discovered in a monastery on the slopes of Mount Sinai. And this is essentially a pretty complete copy of the Old Testament and the New Testament that comes from about 350 AD. So one of the most remarkable discoveries of the last couple of hundred years. Here is a manuscript that goes right back to this period. The exciting thing is that when we compare something like Codex Sinaiticus with what Erasmus comes up with, it's almost entirely the same. There are very, very few, very minor differences. You can ask about those if you'd like to. But substantially, it is exactly the same. So we only learnt this in the last couple of hundred years. but the texts that Erasmus was working with were really accurate copies of those texts. You compare those with the texts from 200s and 300s AD, and they are substantially the same. We have remarkably reliable manuscripts. Compared to almost anything else that we try and establish about the ancient world, the manuscripts of the Bible are many more and much earlier than many other texts. We have wonderfully reliable manuscripts. Let's come on to the next question. Do we have reliable translations? There are lots of them out there. If you know anything about Bible translations, you'll know there are lots out there, and sometimes they can look quite different. And again, it can make you wonder, do we really know what the Bible actually said if all these translations look so different? I'll give you one example. This is from a letter in the New Testament called 2 Corinthians. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 12, he writes, well, what does he write? Here's the King James Version, published in 1611. Ye are not straitened in us, but ye are straitened in your own bowels. The ESV, so here are two 21st century translations. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. The NIV, we are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. You might look at that and think, well, how can we possibly know what Paul really means? Because we've got straightening, we've got restricting, we've got withholding, we've got bowels, we've got affections. What's going on? Well, this is just a nice example of how the work of translation is a complicated thing. In the time of the New Testament, the idea of it's here, tois blanknois, those are your bowels, your entrails, your intestines. In the Greek world at the time, that's a way of speaking about where you feel things, where you're the seat of your affections. We don't really talk about that all that much, do we? We might say go with your gut, but otherwise we're going to talk about entrails as having a different job and talk about them much less often. The King James Version here is simply trying to stick pretty closely to the Greek, painstakingly close to the Greek. So it's quite a good word-for-word sort of translation. Straightened in the 17th century had a bit more of this idea of being constricted and constrained within a strait. And so partly here we're just looking at how 17th century English works. ESV and NIV are just doing the difficult work of translating, where you've got ideas in the Greco-Roman world about bowels and trying to put it in terms that people will now understand. The ESV is trying to stick a little bit closer to the word order and to the more literal sense in 2 Corinthians. The NIV here is trying to express more clearly what it actually is trying to communicate. That we are not withholding our affection from you, you are withholding yours from us. Not a problem that there are different translations with really different words going on, because we can see it all the way back. We can read what Paul actually wrote, and we can think, well, how do you communicate that to different audiences, in different times, in different places? That's how we end up with different translations, but all of them able to work back to the original there in helpful ways. So translations, you might like to ask more about that, but that's one example. Do we have the right books in the Bible? This is a question that often comes up. If you've thought about this question at all, you might have thought about particularly different lives of Jesus that have been written. So in the New Testament, we have the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. And if you've read or watched the Da Vinci Code or other things like that, you might know that there are also other Gospels out there. There's the Gospel of Philip, there's the Gospel of Thomas, there's the Gospel of Mary. And people wonder, why are they not included and those four are? Sometimes you'll hear the idea that there's something of a conspiracy going on. That at some point the political leaders got together and decided these are the four Gospels that we accept, these are the ones that we're happy with, and we'll cut out the rest. And the Council of Nicaea that happened in AD 325 is sometimes described in that way, as Constantine tried to limit what would go into the Bible. That really doesn't work. It doesn't work for two reasons. First of all, because the the church was already talking about the four Gospels that are the authentic record of the life of Jesus. And you get that as early as the 2nd century. Figures like Irenaeus and Tatian and others, ask more about that if you'd like to. But already the church, long before Nicaea, are saying these are the four Gospels. These are the four eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. We trust these. The other reason that argument doesn't work about some kind of conspiracy is because you really wouldn't pick these four. Actually, these four texts are quite inconvenient if you're a political leader, because they describe Jesus talking about how he is a king over and above political rulers, how he is the one to whom they must give an account. They're actually very uncomfortable political texts if you're trying to just endorse yourself and find a version that is more palatable to you. Do we have the right books in the Bible? There was not some later conspiracy to try and include things that should have been. We'll come back to some other arguments in favour of these books being the right books in a moment. Let's come on to that next question, though. Can we trust what we read in the Bible? Lots that we might say here. Can we trust the Bible when it tells us things? One of the things that we would want to do is just say the Bible includes lots of different genres, lots of different kinds of literature. There is poetry, there is narrative, there is history. And so across the Bible, the way that the church has thought about it is you can trust the Bible to communicate what it's trying to communicate to you, and to read it sensitively to those different genres. So a poem is reliable, but not in the same way that a historical narrative is reliable. One is trying to tell you what actually happened. The other is trying to tell you how the person that they love is like a dove. Not actually a dove. It's trustworthy, it's reliable as poetry to communicate something to you, but we just need to read the Bible sensitive to a lot of different genres that are going on in there. That's one thing that's helpful to remember. Let's focus, though, a bit more on the life of Jesus. Let's come back to those Gospels. They are claiming to be historical records. They're claiming to be the writing of eyewitnesses who were there, who saw and heard Jesus' life and teaching, and so eyewitness accounts of what happened. And there is remarkable evidence that they are exactly that they are eyewitness testimonies, that in reading these books, we can genuinely go back and find out who this man Jesus was, what did he say, what did he do. There's one book in particular that I want to recommend. It's this one by Pete Williams called Can We Trust the Gospels? And what he does is go through a lot of the details that you find in those books of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and show that they have a knowledge of the time and the area and the places that would be impossible to have if you were not actually there. So, for example, he looks at a knowledge of geographical features, of the distances between places and the time it would take to get from there to here, the sort of direction you would be going in. Something that's almost impossible to reproduce from a different time and a different place. Imagine you were trying to write a story about life in rural Ireland 30 years ago. Imagine you didn't have Wikipedia or Google Maps, and you were trying to give a really accurate sense of where everything is and who lives where and what different places are called and what's the local name for that lake or that sea. The Gospels have all that sort of knowledge, all that sort of detail. It's remarkable. I don't think he'd mind me saying, he goes into some slightly geeky detail. For example, he gets into the frequency of names that are found in Palestine in the 1st century. So you know how there are kind of fashions in names, and different areas have different names that come up more often than not. He looks at the distribution of names that are there in the Gospels and finds they correlate to how popular those names were in Palestine. Again, very hard to get right at any distance of time or place. To get right how many Collins and Malcolms you're going to find in Scotland in the 1950s. Really hard to do that without Wikipedia and other things and census information. It even gets the frequency of names right, where you need to start disambiguating between people who've got the same name. I came up to Oxford in 98 and to study classics. And in my college, there were two of us called Dave. We were both classic students, so you couldn't sort us out that way. We were both from Birmingham, so you couldn't sort us out that way. The only way to sort us out in the end, well, probably not the only way, but the way that it happened was he was called Small Dave, and I was called Suave Dave. The reason I was called Suave Dave was only because at the time I had a black velvet jacket, and in the views of my peers, what can I say, it was considered suave. I dropped out after about 5 weeks of a classics degree, so he did have the last laugh, and after that he was just Dave. But there are times, aren't there, when you need to separate out who people are because there's just lots of Davids around. Well, in the Gospels, you find exactly the same thing. You find Simons and Marys and Judases, those really common names, and they're being disambiguated. This is Simon, the son of whoever, because this is an eyewitness account. It genuinely, accurately reflects what was happening in the life of Palestine at the time. So, time is rushing away. I'll leave that alone. Except to recommend that book, and to commend to you the Gospels as remarkably accurate pictures of the life of Jesus. And that was my way into the Christian life. So I'm age 17, not been brought up reading the Bible or going to church, but it was when I was 17 that I just started looking into these things and asking myself, could you really know who this man Jesus was? Are these things historically accurate? Can I trust what I'm reading here? And then what am I going to do with the fact that there is a man called Jesus who teaches these things, who performs these things, and then very quickly people are saying they will give their lives for him and they will worship him as God. It's an extraordinary thing, but it was wrestling with some of those questions that helped me. All right, let's come to the second part of our question, and I'm going to try and speed up a bit. Is the Bible outdated? In some ways, we might think that's the worst crime, rather being unreliable, being outdated. I imagine if it was us and you had the choice of being either unreliable or outdated, which one would you rather be? Possibly outdated. Need to recognize that objection often rests with an assumption about us and where we now stand, doesn't it? To call something outdated is to say we are in the present and we see things rightly and accurately and with a kind of moral clarity. For anything to be right, it needs to be up to date. So you know how food has a kind of best before sticker on it? We kind of treat ideas as if they have a best after date. There's a point at which if it's close enough to us, it's acceptable, it's what we think, it's what everyone always should have thought. We have this idea that what is thought of now is somehow right in the measure of all things. As the great theologian Agent Coulson once said, people tend to confuse the words new and improved. We assume that what is current is best, morally and in other ways. Now, there are some pretty big issues with that. It is hard, isn't it, to know where to draw the line. If some things are considered outdated, when are things in date? Is it just in the kind of post-Enlightenment world where we think since then people have been thinking rightly and clearly and objectively? It's pretty hard to say that because there's a lot of very offensive and things that we don't like that have been thought in the last few hundred years. Even in the last 20 years, you would find a consensus about things that now we think are appalling and terrible. Where do you draw the boundary? The scary thought is that 20 years from now, people are going to look back on us and think they were outdated. How could they think that was okay? This thought that we stand in a particular place that allows us to declare other things as outdated is a pretty vulnerable place, isn't it? Wondering who might be coming for us. There's an element of pride to it as well. Here's C.S. Lewis on this point. Every age has its own outlook. And so there's the danger of what he calls chronological snobbery, of thinking that somehow our outlook on the world is pure. We need to recognize that we're all especially good at seeing certain truths, especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. that we don't stand in this place of objective purity, that we don't see things ourselves now with such clarity that everything else can be considered outdated. Really helpful. One of the things that I want to suggest in particular about the Bible is that it can be a help to us because it has in every age helped cultures see themselves differently, to see their own blind spots. The truth of the Bible is that it's never sat comfortably in one age. There's never been a generation that have thought, yeah, this is what we say. There's nothing uncomfortable about this. This sums us up. Actually, the Bible has always had the effect of challenging and rebuking the times that it was written in. It's another reason to think it is really reliable, because it's not some piece of historical propaganda. It's not God's people writing about themselves and how awesome they are. Actually, what you would find over and over again is the Bible confronting the times to which it is written in words of real challenge, helping them see their blind spots. The Bible then doesn't sit comfortably in any one time, and nor is it tied to any one time. The experience of people right the way down through the centuries has been that it does speak with a particular power, that it helps us to understand some of our intuitions about human life and who we are and where we've come from, and it challenges and provokes us. Let me just give a couple of quick examples, and then, having overrun, I'll stop. The first, the thought that human beings are made in the image of God. There's that moment of creation in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. The idea that human beings are made in the image of God, it explains to us a very deep intuition we have about the value and dignity of people, that we are all created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. But it grounds that. It actually says there is a reason to think that. But at the same time, it really deeply challenges us. It says to us, first of all, that we must treat all people equally, however different they are from us, however, wherever they live that is so far away from us, however they vote or think about issues that are so different to us, they too are equal to us. But it also challenges us to recognize that we don't simply interpret ourselves. That if we want to understand who we really are, we have to understand that we are made in relation to another, that we bear God's image, that we're formed for relationship rather than just being our own little project to try and understand ourselves or create ourselves. The other story we could talk about, and we'll do that very quickly, here's Rembrandt's version of the prodigal son. It's a story that Jesus tells, and it is such a powerful story of two sons. There's a son who goes to his father and says, I want my inheritance, I want everything I'm due, and he goes off and spends it in really self-destructive and wasteful ways. He comes home, and the father sees him, rushes out to greet him, and the older brother is there saying, hold on a minute, I've been slaving all my life, and how can you just welcome this guy back? It's a story that, again, speaks to our deepest longings for home, for a welcome, for a place where we feel safe. But it's also a story that deeply challenges us. It points out that most of us are one of those two brothers, either living our lives in self-destructive and wasteful ways, or slaving away and looking down on others who haven't made as wise decisions as we have, acting in ways that are self-righteous and proud. It's a story that says to us the only way home is to acknowledge those things about ourselves. So the Bible, down the centuries, has always had this great power, both to help us understand who we are and some of our deepest intuitions, but also to challenge us, to speak to us, to speak against us even. And in that way, it's never out of date. All right, that's me. Thank you.